Hi, everyone. This is the Newsphere podcast, our second episode. Today, we have a very exciting topic because it's developing in real time in front of our eyes. A change in the policy of the global hegemon, aka the United States, towards the understanding of spheres of influence and respecting them, and doing whatever it can to preserve its trade routes, its energy, rare earths, and finally, to reshore manufacturing.
I thought this would be a really interesting topic because it's caught my eye ever since Maduro was captured in Venezuela. Talks about annexing Greenland start to escalate, and I'm thinking, like, why is so much happening and where is all this energy coming from in the new year? So it got me curious to understand, I guess, more deeply the drivers, domestic and international, that are forcing or influencing the administration into making the decisions that they are.
In recent memory, we experienced a US that was unapologetically globalist, right? Under the
Yes.
Obama administration, Clinton administration. You might go as far back as the George Bush Sr. administration with the advent of NATO, the advent of China entering the WTO. And it's interesting because there's just so much of a shift in mentality from one where it was about US's interests as how much power can it accumulate, having the reserve currency of the world, being respected as the world's policeman and arbiter of everything, to now where it's more about, well, what actually serves the interest of Americans.
The American public in general has voiced deep concerns about their
quality of life, right?
Their quality of life, their disillusionment with the American dream. This can all be seen from the shrinking middle class and how people are finding it harder to find meaningful jobs, and companies are finding it harder to create meaningful jobs, and it affects the middle class. Because of that, I think it just becomes an issue that is hard to ignore. And we've reached the point where it's starting to gain critical mass.
Absolutely. And you kind of see this reflection where foreign policy in a way is domestic policy, right? Like how the US treats its trading partners, right? Will hugely influence how America works and how it prospers and how it exercises its power in the world. And I want to get into this a bit of a segue, because I know you've mentioned this to me a bunch, right? Which is, like, during the Obama administration, the priorities were so different. Like, what were some of those priorities and how would you contrast them to now?
Well, in the Obama administration, they were really focused on reaching sustainability metrics on the world stage and making sure they had good agreements in place with different countries that are monitoring carbon metrics. And green policies were huge in this era. The Obama administration is really known for pushing forth the Paris Climate Agreement and also implementing a lot of domestic green policies within the United States. Honestly, the way they're implemented carbon credits to businesses end up looking like tax. I think they found it really hard to keep operations lean. And it really affected their ability to grow. And I think this is a major factor that has affected industrialization within the United States.
Yeah, fair enough. And I like the example of sustainability because I think it's a microcosm for the attitude, which is sustainability and reducing carbon emissions is very much a global initiative. It's one where you kind of need collaboration among many nations to make it work. And whereas now these matters that do matter to the US, be it energy security, acquiring and maintaining rare earths, which is critical to their strategy now and always should have been, the maintenance of trade routes, and of course, reshoring manufacturing. Like, these things are unapologetically localized interests, right? And they are now in direct competition with global interests in many ways, right? Like, what's good for the US may not be good for the world anymore. And that's very clear. And you kind of see the shift because when you talk about sustainability and globalization, it was very much about the US being a force for good or freedom and democracy, the shining city on a hill. And now it's very much about, well, this more mercantilist strategy. What can we get? What can we exploit from the rest of the world to make ourselves richer and ensure our own prosperity?
I want to say something though, that green policies aren't always bad, right? The way that China has implemented their green policy, and I think this was introduced in 2010 and 2015. This was when China was known worldwide for their terrible management of pollution. You can see those infamous pictures of top cities like Beijing and Shanghai being polluted to the max. You can't even see. There's just so much smog in the air, and the air quality index was so bad. And so China introduced a kind of green policy that looked like the antithesis of a tax. They actually introduced a green policy that would subsidize engineering companies that are working on sustainable solutions. What we can see that came out of this initiative was the proliferation of electric vehicle manufacturing, solar panel manufacturing, renewables energy within China improved so much, and they've done such a good job at bringing the cost curves down. And because of globalization and free trade, they've been able to export these goods to the rest of the world, and the whole world has been able to benefit from the lowered cost of renewable energy goods that China has been able to produce because of a domestic policy. And this is an example where a local and domestic policy ends up being really beneficial for all the countries in the world. It's also an example where a good policy combined with an industrial policy can really benefit the world in a major way. I don't think the US currently has the capacity to do right now, because it has become so deindustrialized in the last several decades. Like, the industrial base in the US has been hollowed out, and we know for a fact that most industries in the US rely on international supply chains, particularly Chinese supply chains, up to 60, 80, 90%.
Mm-hmm.
And so the United States is in a situation where it is highly dependent on Chinese supply chains to...
Let's get into that. And why is this a matter of national security, right? Well, if you don't control your supply chains or are highly dependent on what is becoming your preeminent or adversary on a global stage, which China is, there's potential hotspots in Taiwan and even more. Rare earths is a very good example where the US had complete reliance at the stage on, almost complete reliance on rare earths coming from China. And this is essential for military equipment, essential for pretty much all our modern manufacturing supply chains, from making cars to electronic devices to making the coveted AI chips that we rely on to keep our edge. That is something that China has secured for itself and is using as a high leverage in its negotiation with the US for this new world order.
For what it needs, yeah. Given past circumstance, as we mentioned earlier, the debt crisis that the US is absolutely facing, this is something that Trump has had to deal with. Honestly, it was a major talking point when he was campaigning for his current term, is that if he gets elected, he would fix this. He would bring the debt down.
Well, arguably, it's accelerating faster than it ever has.
Yeah.
But tariffs were supposed to be the tool that would bring it down considerably. It's still yet to be seen if that's the case.
With tariffs, Trump was kind of gung-ho and hell-bent with introducing the use of tariffs to do debt crisis management in the US. But I personally didn't really understand the economics of implementing really tough tariffs on many countries at once. And it's something that has pushed China towards the edge of its seat.
The US historically hasn't had tariffs, right? But, in the earlier part of the 20th century, it did. So this is not something new, or at least entirely new. And one of the presidents that implemented some of the highest tariffs was McKinley. And Trump is modeling a bit of a strategy after him. And we should be clear, it's not like the US unilaterally introduced tariffs. Other countries had tariffs on US imports for the longest time, including China. So in many ways, the starting point of starting to introduce tariffs was payback for what other countries were doing for US produced goods. Europe is also a culprit, where they would.
Wait, is this something that has happened historically, or are we
Well,
talking
no,
about the present
even at the
day?
start of the Trump administration, the current one, Europe, China had high tariffs on US goods. So this is a bit of trying to catch up to what other countries are doing to the US and US manufacturers. And tariffs, yes, they are a tool to potentially manage the debt. But the campaign promise was really about reshoring US manufacturing for two reasons. Ensuring national security, because the US has to control its supply chains to be able to feed itself, to ensure it has a ready and able military, a bunch of other things. And in addition, the tariffs bring in new revenue because the US it's getting close with China, but it still is the best customer in the world.
For Chinese goods.
Everyone wants to sell to the American market. They're rich, they have a consumer culture, and they're big. There's a lot of people. And I think Trump understands that there's this window of time where he has this leverage left, right? And tariffs are used alongside military posturing in his more mercantilist approach to global trade. And I think you can see this in various ways, where one of the things that the US really has to secure, and you bring this all the time, is rare earths. So why are rare earths important? What would your answer be?
It is the end all be all, the one element without which
Our entire modern technology industry just fails. Yeah. Every iPhone, every car, every fighter jet, every missile depends on these rare earth minerals. And China has how much of the supply chain controlled?
Up to 90%
Up to
of
90.
the world's refinement of rare earth minerals come from China.
Yeah, and China recognizes that, and that's why in its negotiations, and it's, of course, the heated hotspots around Taiwan and all that stuff, it does use rare earths as a bargaining chip. Oh, we're gonna cut off the supply, or you have until this date to drop your tariffs, otherwise you won't get the rare earths. And that's a national security risk.
In my opinion, though, China retaliated from the negotiations, and Trump's push for adding tariffs to Chinese export goods. They retaliated to tariffs by sanctioning the use of rare earth metals for the use of defense manufacturing. That's what they did. But it's one of those things where, because China is in such a good position right now, it's been able to play this chip, the problem of Taiwan and China wanting to claim Taiwan, but US asserting that it should be independent and that the US should continue to have strong influence over that country. So Taiwan is obviously a hotspot. And because US still holds so much power over the situation, China just hasn't been able to get what they want. China has been in this position for a really long time. It's finally in a state where it's able to come up and say, hey, you know what? We've got this card and we're going to play it. And guess what? We're going to sanction you.
Yeah.
The administration.
It's interesting because when China did that, I feel like something else happened in the US's strategy, which is a realization that just as the US needs rare earths, China has an insatiable demand and hunger for energy to keep its manufacturing base going. It needs oil and energy from Iran, from Russia. And so I think the US, recognizing that, hey, it still has a very powerful military, it can go and create these issues for China with regards to its energy supply chain, because China is not resource independent when it comes to energy. So
it's got a lot of good green energy, though.
It has a lot of green energy, but it still needs coal. It has a lot of coal.
Supply from Russia, right?
Well, yeah, and that's one of the key issues here, where the war between Ukraine and Russia was so bad for U.S. policy regarding China because it brought Russia closer to China. And historically, that should not have been the case.
Okay.
But now you have, the world's most energy rich nation in terms of natural gas, has all the minerals, gold, silver. It's just a literal gold mine, right? Mm-hmm. It got a rapprochement to China through all
I
this.
think Russia and China are really good partners. Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, the announcement of the sanctioning of rare earth metals sent, by the way, shocks and ripples across the American industrial supply chain, where so many companies are now projecting really weak revenue across future quarters.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Already that kind of effect.
Yes. It's already being baked in to the financial models and COGS. And we're starting to see that margins are starting to slip. Mm-hmm. And companies are not able to secure the goods in time and meet their production needs. And this is so dire, and it's obviously made its way up to the White House. And they know that this is a really big issue, and that's why they're scrambling to do something about this. It's no longer something you plan out for 3-5 years in advance. It's not something theoretical that looks good in paper to do because you're a dominant guy and you want to exert a dominant position. It's literally that multiple huge industries in your country might be just severely affected because of sanctions that are out of control and you can't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. I think that this is one of the main reasons why Greenland is currently being talked about the way that it is. It's because it's literally a saving grace for the United States at the moment. Although I have not looked into domestic sources of rare earth.
Well, those are going to be
mines
rejiggered up again, I'm sure. I think there's a $12 billion investment coming. That's just a starting point. Greenland is an interesting segue into this, which is we've talked about energy. Mm-hmm. We've talked about rare earths. And we're trying to make sense of this strategy that seems so chaotic. Greenland is not just about the resources. You see the Arctic. You will see just how vital it can be as a trade route. Asia to North America to Europe to everything would be so much faster. It could be the best, most efficient shipping lane in the world. Mm-hmm. And it's so important strategically for military reasons as well.
Why are trade routes so important? One can argue that trade routes essentially is the main feature of globalism. Do you want to expand?
Well, if it's more expensive or much more expensive to get goods from point A to point B because you have to circumnavigate the globe to get it there, your costs are higher, you're going to fall behind as a manufacturing giant. When you look at the new axis of resistance against the US as a hegemon, of course you have China, you have Russia, you also have Iran. One of Iran's most potent threats to the US is that it can close the Strait of Hormuz and therefore cause major blockages for global shipping lanes. That is a counterpunch that the US might experience at some point as well, is what if that strait is closed?
Could you maybe talk a little bit about the relationship between trade routes and free trade?
Let's say you're at war, which we're expecting may happen at some point. Closing off trade routes is like cutting off the stock that your military is going to need to fight a prolonged war. It's cutting off your domestic population from all the field goods that come with cheap goods, bread, circuses, everything, to keep them happy enough for a prolonged war. It's so strategically important to have control over your trade routes and, have leverage over those of your enemies. In times of peace, trade routes are important for another reason. You collect fees from those trade routes. So imagine you're clipping off the top as global trade works through your system. That's a lot of revenue you can get. In fact, you could argue that a huge part of Egypt's economy works today just because of the choke point it has.
And the globalist approach that the United States have nurtured over the last many decades to preserve its status of leading and managing and controlling the free trade routes of the world has also benefited not only US, but all the other countries that participate in NAFTA and WTO.
Yeah, I mean,
So it's a good thing that there is a policy of open borders, right? It brings down the cost of goods for everyone. Sorry, not open borders, just open trade routes.
Open trade routes. So yeah, I think it's a policy of reciprocity. You know, you're not going to interfere with our flow of goods. We won't interfere with yours. And this is why, Trump during his campaign, let's just look back a year ago, it was always about we're getting ripped off. We do all these things for the world, but they tariff us and we don't tariff them back, right? We provide the rails on which global trade and commerce works, but we are not benefiting from it as we should.
Yes.
And that was the realization is like, hey, we built all this stuff. We built the Panama Canal. Why is it being rented out to the Chinese, right? We made the world safe so that trade could happen. Where's our cut? And that's the realization, even when it comes to NATO, is that, like the US would, European countries for which NATO ensures its defense, they're not paying their fair share.
Are they not?
I don't know if that's changed much recently, but I know when Trump was campaigning, it was true that some European countries were not paying the percent of GDP they were supposed to pay to NATO.
And I think that was between 3 and 5%.
I don't know if it was that high, but we'll see.
I think that's a recent thing that Trump's been trying to reduce, 3 to 5% minimum spending of overall GDP towards a NATO country's military. I want to circle back though, and maybe talk a little bit about all this like international trade business. You mentioned that Trump is angry, that he feels like the country has put a lot of work into developing international trade routes, but is benefiting from it the least. Do you think in the past administrations and historically the way that the country has been managed for the last many, many years, maybe there is something that they've missed and failed to do, which is to protect the interest and benefits of its middle class? It's introduced policies that is counterintuitive to the growth and maintenance of the middle class. And that's why we're seeing these effects many years later, that there's no longer an industrial base within the country, primarily because the international competition has bought out their ability to operate within the country. And that is what the current administration is trying to bring back.
I think they're trying to bring it back with various tools, but it could be a symptom of something that has nothing to do with any given current administration at the time. Just the fact that the US has the world's global reserve currency. And there's a term, I forget what it's called, it's global reserve currency curse or something along those lines, where because the world wants your dollars, it will eventually and gradually gut out your manufacturing base and move you towards a service-based economy. And you saw that.
Why is this the case?
It's because to deal in global trade, other countries need US dollars and therefore are willing to sell you goods for cheap relative to what you're willing to sell to them for cheap and relatively. Eventually, you just cannot make goods domestically cheaply enough to compete with the goods made overseas for your own consumer base. So that's why dollars get exported and we import goods. The primary export of the United States, you could argue, is the US dollar. And that's what every country uses up until recently, because what happened with the Russia-Ukraine war is that the US started using it as a bludgeon to seize Russian assets, US dollars and bank accounts, all these types of things. And then all of a sudden the world realized, hey, this is the world's policeman. They have the biggest military in the world. They're extremely powerful. They're acting a bit chaotic. And now we don't even know what we have in our bank accounts or whether it's really ours. I think ever since there's been a shift in strategy for a lot of these countries to move off of some of these US rails like SWIFT and so on. SWIFT being the payment system for major energy contracts and other commodities. I think that's something that maybe underlies all of this.
Is the predicament of bearing the status of global reserve currency.
Yes, but you could argue the other things matter too. Tariffs are a way to fight a bit of that back. Obviously, it's a counterbalancing move, right? Naturally, once you have tariffs, countries cannot export their goods as cheaply to you, and it brings in revenue. There is such a great promise for the American middle class. If this were to work, we don't know yet, but if it were to work, the middle class would have this as their reality. We collect revenues from China because they sell their goods to us, and in effect, we can get rid of the income tax because we're getting so much revenue from people exporting to us to access our consumer market. And imagine what that would do to the middle class to have no income tax.
It'd make them really happy.
It sure would, right? It's a great campaign promise.
Yeah.
And that was the reality for America in, I think, the earlier part of the 20th century. Little to no income tax and high tariffs.
Back to the present reality, though, is that the U.S. is now being challenged on the world stage.
Yes.
They are facing some serious constraint.
Do you think it's too little, too late?
I think China is holding many cards at the moment, and we can already see the progression towards hemispheric blocks, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And, pipelines are already introduced to regain some of that onshore manufacturing capabilities within the US to build out the industrial base and the working class. Maybe the US should just not tariff China.
Yes. And what about too late from the US as the global policeman's perspective? They can no longer be that, right? They have to retreat to their hemisphere.
I don't think so in that case, unless a war starts between US and China. But I think that the international trade routes are still being maintained by the US, and they are actually investing even more monies into this program, right? They're increasing the American military budget, and it's going to be up to $1.5 trillion. And so the US is actually investing even more into maintaining their status, their protectionist status over the world. But at the same time, it's also realizing the mistakes that I think it's made in the past and what should and could be done at the moment to save the momentum of the United States and improve its condition. I think that's my general opinion.
Fair enough. Now, how about on Taiwan? Because let's say that's the hot spot on which a global war would start from. What would be the cascading events from there? I can think of, okay, well, the first thing is, if there's a war over Taiwan, Taiwan is the world's foundry. The AI chips stop the flow in all directions, right? That has major repercussions. But what else? What would happen to China? What would happen to the US in a situation like that? What would they do to each other, both militarily and economically, to inflict pain over the issue?
There was this strategic report released from the US government which said that the US is not in a position to go into war over Taiwan with China, and that if they were ever put in a situation, they would actually back out and let it happen.
Okay, that's pretty clear what would happen. Yeah. So it's an eventuality that Taiwan is taken back.
I'm not sure.
Not sure, right? Yeah.
Maybe, perhaps so. On the topic of hemispheric defense, though, where do you see us transitioning from soft power to maybe more realpolitik?
Yeah. So for the audience, realpolitik is really no more pretense. There's no longer this whole, we're doing this for good or to free people or whatever it is, right? And soft power is exercised differently. It's like, okay, well, I have the bat, but I'm holding a big stick and talking, right? Realpolitik is more, I'm going to beat you as we go along here and negotiate. Well, there was a president, Monroe, who on the hemispheric topic really did engage in that type of foreign policy to exude US influence over its hemisphere. And Trump has adopted that kind of mentality. His administration, I think, in tongue-in-cheek, says, well, this is now the Trump-Doe Doctrine or something like that. Donroe, that's the one. Trump, the Donroe Doctrine. Yes, that's the one. So that's that's a new reality. It's going to be the Donroe Doctrine. So let's summarize what we're leaving you with here today. We've touched on a lot, and we live in a chaotic world. At least it appears that way. Why is the administration capturing Maduro in Venezuela, fighting over Greenland, threatening to make Canada the 51st state, and on and on and on? It seems very chaotic. It's happening left, right, and center. We're just in a new world where it's not about soft power as much anymore. It's just about being more explicit about the US's desires and wants. And there are 4 pillars that really matter in this new order of hemispheric defense. 1, securing energy, or using it as a cudgel against the US enemies. 2, rare earths. You're going to hear that again and again and again. It is critical to the modern supply chains. 3, reshoring US manufacturing through the use of tariffs, by incentivizing and providing subsidies domestically, and a bunch of other things. And finally, trade routes. These are the choke points that can be used in times of war and are very profitable in times of peace. All right, that's it. And we'll see how this Donroe Doctrine progresses.
Plays out.
Plays out.
Yeah. Right. Thanks everyone for joining us on this week's episode.